district director, and we're going to talk about the small business loans, particularly the PPP and the EIDL loans, and what they mean, not only general concept, but more importantly, if people have been fortunate enough to get one of these, basically what happens then? What's next? What can I do? It's a loan, but under certain circumstances, they may be considered a grant. And how do I make sure that I comply to make sure that my loan becomes a grant? So we're very fortunate to have Julio with us tonight, to be made himself available to answer questions and to explain the program a little bit more in detail. So with that, I'll turn it over and let's go.
Thank you, Senator and Representative Perola, for having me here. And again, we're part of a family of, I would say nationally, we have over 70 offices around the country under the guise of the Small Business Administration. In Connecticut, we have two offices, one here in Hartford, the other one is in Bridgeport, which is a satellite office. And there are a number of staff members that are professional in terms of what they do and how they reach out to all the small businesses here in the state of Connecticut. Now, since March 15, the state of Connecticut was declared a disaster state. And under that premise, the United States Small Business Administration also accepted that declaration and immediately back on the 15th opened up what we call the disaster assistance programs, which started out with what the senator mentioned, the idol of what we call the economic injury disaster loan. That was the first program that was established here in Connecticut. Connecticut was the third state in the nation to have been declared. And so we kind of ramped up pretty quickly ahead of most of the states in the union to be able to support most of the small businesses when they first started applying. When that program was introduced back on the 15th, it was really through the portal of SBA. You had to go onto the SBA website and you had to register. You had to put in your information and you had to submit documents and you were given a number. And then you had to wait. We were told here at our offices that it would take about 21 to 30 days for an application to go through that process because it was a it was a manual program where you had an underwriter. That underwriter would actually be contacting you, and that type of loan is for 30 years. So if you have actually applied for the economic injury disaster loan, what you're really applying is for a 30-year term loan. That rate would be 3.75%, and the maximum under that loan would be $2 million. So when that program kicked up and ramped up, that was really what SBA was offering here in the state of Connecticut. Moving forward, what happened about 10 days after the 15th, there was this other program that was announced through Congress called the Advanced Program, the Advanced Economic Injury Disaster Loan. That was up to $10,000. That was an emergency advance loan that SBA was providing for businesses that would apply for this immediate $10,000 with the premise that it was going to be processed within 3 days. And it was very low tech. There was nothing outside of you inputting your basic business information and how many employees you had. Because of the demand under that program, if you went onto the website, it said up to $10,000. But so many businesses nationally applied for that program that what happened was that SBA made a concerted decision that the only way they could help every business that was applying through that program was limited to $1,000 per employee. So if you had 3 employees, you would get $3,000 under that advanced program. And that was what was structured in a lot of businesses. By the end of the month of March, you then had this thing with the CARES Act, which introduced this PPP, which is what everyone's talking about, the Paycheck Protection Program. That was launched towards the end of the month when the president and the White House, Congress and the Senate all agreed on this massive bill that was $649 billion to assist small businesses nationally. So on the 3rd of April, that program was launched. The banks really weren't prepared. They basically knew something was coming, but on the 3rd of April, which was a Friday, all of the banks in the United States were then supposed to be the conduit to deliver $649 billion of funding that was going to be made available to all small businesses. Well, the massive rush for this program, within 14 days after the 3rd of April, $649 billion was basically used up. And so by the end of, I'm trying to time myself, 2 weeks later, the funding ran out. So the program temporarily shut down. This included the PPP, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, the EIDL, and also the Advance. All three programs basically by we're looking around the 17th of April, ran out of money. So Congress then met, they decided then to refund the program. And by this past Monday, another tranche of money that totaled $320 billion was refunded into the the Paycheck Protection Program, which reopened then this Monday. And so businesses again started to reapply. There were different features that were added to this bill that the previous bill didn't have, where $60 billion of that program is going to be then limited to smaller banks and community credit unions and smaller, what they call CDFI, community loan funds that could actually apply and become certified to lend money through the PPP program. So the $60 billion tranche basically was captured was for banks that had assets of less than 50 billion down to assets under $25 billion. And then when I'm looking at Connecticut in terms of what bank is larger than that, outside of national banks, outside of the big Bank of Americas and such, almost every bank in the state of Connecticut, except for maybe People's Bank and a little bit of Webster, every other bank in the state qualifies to continue to accept applications because of the $60 billion that was set aside for the smaller community banks, since they believe through Congress that these smaller banks have more access to the smaller businesses that were in dire need, since the bigger banks they thought the first tranche of money. And so seeing that right now, most of the banks in the state do fit into this $60 billion, the $60 billion tranche that's now focused to the smaller community banks. And as I just mentioned, all the state banks, except for maybe two, outside of the national banks, do qualify to continue to lend under the PPP, because once the rest of the money under the PPP really would be, all the big banks and all of the banks that are above that $60 billion, up over the $50 billion threshold, can actually continue to lend until that particular tranche of money is expended. And then what's going to remain would be then the 60 billion, which would be then focused for the smaller community banks. So Connecticut is in a good position because, again, as I said, most of the credit unions and the smaller banks fit within that type of realm. What's been happening recently is that now that we've been focused in getting this money into the hands of the small businesses, most of the businesses now have to really reach out to the banks. They have to make sure that the banks have provided them with an approval, and that the banks have committed to make sure that they have an account number for them to have access to that money. There is a rule that was established by Treasury that the minute that the bank gets an authorization, which is pretty quickly from SBA, the minute the bank puts in that information into the system for SBA turns around and gives them an authorization number. They have 10 days to close that loan from the time, so they can't waste time not closing that loan because the Treasury is mandating that these loans must be closed within 10 days. And so during that period, the borrower gets that money. So during that 10-day period, then the Treasury basically is stipulating that that money, the day that they get that money is the day the eight-week period starts. That's when the clock starts for that program money to be used. Understanding that the payroll protection program is a payroll program. It's to make your business whole during that 8-week period. When you applied for that loan, you're basically applying to cover 8 weeks of your payroll. Is to call back your employees, or if you have them, to utilize that money to pay them during that 8 weeks that your business is either shut down or you have diminished staff for whatever reason. You could pay those employees while they're at home. You could pay them when they're in your working for you, whatever means, as long as you have them on the payroll, because the way the program works is that when you apply for the loan, you're basically filling out a form, and all you're doing is just doing some basic numbers. Is you're putting how many employees you had as of the start of February 15th. If I had 5 employees and my average payroll for that 8-week period is $50,000, I am supposed to end at the end of the 8-week period with 5 employees and $50,000 in payroll. Once I end up with that amount of money that I could provide that information to back to your lender, whoever your lender is, then the lender would take that information, provide it back to SBA. SBA will then forgive the balance of that loan. So your loan would be forgiven. So if you have a $50,000 loan that you took to cover your payroll for 8 weeks, and then at the end of the 8th week, they're going to, right now, they're still waiting for information to come back from Treasury, because Treasury promised to release basically more guidance as to what are the procedures, and if there are going to be any forms that the bank is going to use to determine how much money you spent. That's going to be coming. So if you actually went to a lender right now, they probably have very little information, because Treasury still has not released any of the information as to what the bank needs to go to their clients and say, okay, this is what you need to provide me, so I could then use that to provide the bank, and then the bank provides that back to SBA, and within a couple of days, SBA then pays off the loan at the bank, and that includes interest. So the first 6 months of that loan is interest free. So if you pay off your loan within that 8-week period, you don't pay the interest. And the interest technically on this loan is for 2 years. It's a 2-year loan at 1%. So the first 6 months of that loan, you're not paying any interest, any balance that you cannot justify, because whatever your payroll is going to be prorated. So if you only wind up with 2 employees, or you only call them back and you only use them for, rather than the 8-week period, you use them for 4 weeks, it's going to be prorated. So whatever your final number is, that balance would then be termed out for that 2-year period. And then you would, after the 6 months of no interest, you would then start paying interest at 1% for the remainder of the loan balance, which, as I said, is for 2 years.
So very good job there, Julio, explaining an overview on the PPP program. A couple of questions just to follow up. I know that it's primarily a payroll protection program, and that's the major focus, but there's also an element of expenses that are allowed. How do we get to that? I mean, how is that determined? I understand it's 25%, but could you explain what expenses qualify? And also, as you're talking about this, like just some practical questions. We talk about that 8-week period. If somebody were to receive that, in April, and rent, I think, is one of the expenses, would April, May, and June, because all 3 months would be included in that 8-week period, would rent for each of those months? And kind of explain what's the parameter, or if I had a utility bill optimum that I get today in April, but it includes March charges, do those count, or is it only for April, May, and June, that 8-week period?
Right. It's the 8-week period that's covered from the date that you took the loan. So it doesn't go back, it'll go forward for those 8-week period. So when you're submitting your paperwork to your lender, that's the information that you're providing them, and then they're just going to tap into your loan balance, whatever that is. Now, the way the program is structured, it was originally supposed to be 100% for payroll. Uh, Congress included this caveat that you could include 25% of your operating, uh, those items, which include rent, the interest on your mortgage, if you have a mortgage or debt on your business, not personal. Because if you have a mortgage and you put it through your business, then yes, it is, you can include it. But if you don't have, so if you're paying on a mortgage, but it's off and it's personal, that's not included. It has to be something that is paid through your business. So the interest would be included on that, the utility, whatever your utility costs are, the rent would also then be included in there. Those are the common expenses that are included in the program. Now, after the 8 weeks, what happens is that 25% of that can be forgiven. 75% of that total amount has to be for payroll. So the main focus is the way they structured the program. We'll forgive 75% of your payroll and 25% of your utilities and rent. Whatever the final balance is of that, that would be termed out into a 2-year loan at 1%.
So
Interesting.
Julio, just a follow-up to that. Starting from when the PPP first opened, a lot of constituent businesses mentioned to me they were concerned because they weren't very clear on what the rules were for the forgiveness. They didn't want to walk into a situation expecting that they were going to do all the right things as they understood them, and then find out that the rules got changed and they've spent this money and now they owe it back. Um, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but is there any real wiggle room for the federal government to change the rules and try and claw back some of this money, even though it's been spent properly on payroll?
The rule for that hasn't changed since it was in the CARES Act originally. The rules are the same for the rent. I mean, for the payroll, for the 8 weeks, that hasn't changed. The utilities and the rent hasn't changed. They haven't touched that. What they've done is they've actually put very strict rules as to who can now apply for the program. And the original tranche of money made almost any type of business with less than 500 employees apply, which is what you've been hearing on TV about the Ruth Chris and publicly traded corporations that were taking, I would say, advantage. The program allowed them to. So it's not that they were taking advantage. You have a program that says you can borrow money. If the opportunity is there for these companies, they did. But that was now tightened up where now they have to prove that they do not have secondary sources of ability to raise capital. So that type of borrower now on the second tranche of money would find it very difficult. In fact, the rule goes back. So a lot of these companies are actually giving back their money because they did have other alternative ways of getting money. So we're finding that that's happening now because they've given them a deadline of May 7th. For if you knew that your company can't afford to get money without going through this program, and they know who they are because they're going to get audited sooner or later, and so they're aware of that, and so money is being returned back because of it.
Thanks, and that's good to hear because a lot of folks were really concerned about that and didn't want to enter into the system. So thank you, I appreciate that, Julio.
Yeah, and what's interesting with the program and the issue is can Congress and Treasury extend the deadline of June 30? That's the issue because when you have in a state of you might have states that are up and running before June 30 and get their employees back in. But you have a state like in Connecticut where come June 1st, there's still businesses that are not up and running, and so the employers are the calls that I'm receiving is I'm not going to be able to call back my employees. So I have a whole 30 days where I can't use this money. So what's going to happen to me? And so that is a congressional and a U.S. Treasury issue because they're going to have to deal with the mass businesses that could not call their employees because they're shut down in a state like Connecticut.
So Julio, I think you sent earlier that you'd have to submit the documentation back to the lender. So I would go back to, the bank that issued the loan, not to the SBA. And what kind of documentation are they going to be looking for? They're going to be looking for the actual, invoice and the payment, like the check that's paid. What is it that ultimately the bank, the lender, and SBA are going to be looking for to document your expenses?
One of the basic ones would be the 941s that they submit quarterly, and also the payroll. So if you have payroll either with ADP or one of these private vendors, they're going to be keeping your payroll going for those weeks. So all you're going to do is get those numbers together and provide that back to your bank. If you're not that big and you're a mom and pop type of operation, which is for instance, other people that are borrowing under this program, they're self-employed. So what's going to happen? They're going to be providing proof that they were paying themselves during that 8-week period. So, which could be canceled checks. It could be that, but it can't. The thing is, whatever you're going to do, you have to show that the money went into payroll, whether it's for yourself, the business, your employees. That's what the bank needs to get. So there's going to be some kind of orderly process where, this is what, because that rule is going to come down from Treasury, because I know the banks are also itching to get some kind of information as to what forms and what process they need, because once the 8 weeks is up, the bank now has to turn that over to SBA for SBA to say, yep, let me check the box off, you're good to go, the loan's forgiven.
Interesting. Now, with the funds, do they have to be dedicated in an account and only used at the time the expense comes, or is the lender and SBA going to be looking more just, we gave you a lump and now we're looking for an accounting as to how you spent that, and so it can go into an account and then just be appropriated accordingly?
Well, if you have a payroll company, that's going to show that you're paying your payroll for those 8 weeks. So usually, your payroll service will give you weekly payroll printout, and that's sufficient because that shows the money going to the employees. Now, if you have issues where I can't bring back my employees, well, you could hire other employees. You could bring in, you could do whatever you need to get back up to that 5-employee level. Because if you applied for the program and you said I have 5 employees, and now you're down to 2, you could hire new, you could bring in your family, you could bring in whoever it is to start working during that 8-week period, so that you can pay people on your payroll to meet up with whatever numbers you started with at the beginning. So the goal is to justify, I started with 5, I ended with 5, and my payroll is 50,000. So because that's what the SBA or the bank provided you. Here's $50,000, and you're telling us you're going to use $50,000 during that 8-week period to cover payroll. And also, I'm borrowing for light, gas, that kind of expense. And so they provided you with that money. So what you're going to do for the 25% for your utilities is you're going to provide them your rent payment and utility bill, or your mortgage if you're paying. That's going to be the document you just need to provide.
So,
Okay.
Julio, just to follow on to that, and I appreciate the question about the expenses. We actually just received a question from Katie, and just bear with. So when you fill out the PPP, it doesn't allot for a calculation of rent and utilities, et cetera. The calculation asks, of course, for 2.5 monthly payroll. Is there a way to add money to a business's PPP once they receive the monies, basically to account for those other expenditures like utilities and rent that are eligible?
Right, but banks have been asking that question, can I reopen the loan? The answer is no. Once the loan's been provided, you can only borrow once. It's a one-time loan. Now, if the loan has only been approved, but not closed, which means closing means I got my money, but the bank gave you an authorization that the loan's been approved, you can't, at that point, you can't go back and have them increase the amount. But once the loan's closed, that's it. It's a one-time shot, and then you just have to use the money that was provided to you. We've had mistakes already being called, banks saying, if they didn't close the loan, they can't do the changes. But once the loan is closed, we're being told that they can't go back in and change it.
Okay. We actually just got another question from Angela. Hi, Angela. So if a business received 8 weeks of funding through the PPP loan, and they didn't get the money until, April 20th, but the business closed back on March 20th. Are they eligible for the, well, you may not know this, for the PUA for the time frame before the PPP?
It starts
So
counting.
there's this 1-month window, the PUA thing on the unemployment side. So I don't know if you can answer that, Leo.
Yeah, the 8 weeks begins the time that they're given the money. So it's not backwards thinking or looking backwards. It's going to look forward to making sure that you brought back your employees. So if you're provided the money on a Thursday, and you need to call your employees and you can't get them back in until Monday, then that Monday's, that's your payroll day, then you proceed forward for 8 weeks for that period. So the goal is to get your employees back in for that 8 weeks going forward.
But let's say you're self-employed, retroactively, for that month before you received the PPP, you would be able to apply for the unemployment. Is that your understanding? I know it's a little bit outside the SBA wheelhouse, but
Right, you can't do both. You can't double. That's not my call. That would be Department of Labor. If you tell your employee that you need to come back to work because I'm calling you, the employer could call the Department of Labor and say, hey, I got 5 employees. They don't want to come back to work. They might do something. And, I don't want to get involved with those questions.
So that's kind of the DOL question. And I don't know, unless Kevin or Ben, we get intermittent information from the Department of Labor. It's it's confusing for everybody. So maybe, Angela, we can get back to you. I'll get you an answer tomorrow, and we'll get you that information because I know it's important to you.
Yeah, DOL questions, because the minute that the employer asks that employee to come back, and the employee doesn't want to come back, that's an issue with DOL.
Julio, I got a question. If you get the loan and you use it on expenses that are not covered, does that make you ineligible for the forgiveness of that loan?
Well, at that point, it'll be a term loan. You wouldn't have because you have to provide 75% of that loan to payroll. If you don't provide that, then it'll probably be termed out.
Would that be for the whole amount of the loan or just for the amount you spent that was on not covered items?
Right, whatever you didn't use for payroll would be the term loan, and so
Okay.
you'll be covered for that amount. But the goal is that it's supposed to be used for those specific purposes, because that's what you applied for, and that's what you're attesting that I'm going to be using that for payroll. I'm going to use that for rent, and so that's the intended use of those funds. Now, say for instance, for the whole 8 weeks, I didn't use it. They could turn that out. They could keep it and turn it out and then use that for their own operating expenses after that.
Okay, but to get the forgiveness,
Mhm.
is it a requirement that you have to spend all the way up to 75% on payroll, and in order to get the 25%? Like if I don't, let's say I only use 70% on payroll,
Mhm.
does that make me ineligible for the 25% forgiveness on the expenses?
Well, you already have the most you could get is 25% on the non-payroll, no matter what you do. So you're not gonna get more than 25%, because that's what they gave you from the beginning.
Right.
So you're not gonna get beyond that. So you'll probably wind up getting the forgiveness on the 25% of the payroll, 70, and then the balance winds up being termed out.
Okay.
So the issue really
Go
is to
ahead.
try to keep payroll going during that 8-week period. And I think that the major question, and again, is what happens if I don't have my employees, or I don't, really, that's been the issue. Most of the questions is, I'm only going to be able to bring them back only for half of those 8 weeks because I was shut down, and that winds up being prorated at that point based on the number of weeks and the payroll. That's why you could rehire, you could call in other employees to come in, replacing those that didn't want to come in, if that's your prerogative, how you want to run your business.
Okay. I know that Julio, you had another engagement to go on to. Jason or Ben, do you have any other questions for Julio at this point? Or
I just want to say thank you.
yeah.
I'm pointing my screen here, but we appreciate your time and it's good information for a lot of the small business owners and their employees to be able to hear this and get some questions answered. So I appreciate it, Julio. Thanks very much.
Hey, great
Yeah.
job, Julio. Really appreciate it. You have a lot of information there for everybody tonight. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
I think you did a great job. Thank you, Julio, and thank you to your agency. I mean, they really do a great job. You're doing it here now, but on a whole host of other fronts. So keep up the good work and thank you very much.
Can I just say one final thing, please, for all the ones that are on the town hall? Make sure that you go right away to your banks. Don't procrastinate. This money might go out within the next week. And if you're thinking that this is going to last, the first tranche of money of 650 billion went out in 14 days. The banks are more savvier now because they went through this, the original round, and they're processing over $1 billion an hour. And so this money might not last more than a week. So again, my advice, contact your bank, make sure you get your authorization and your number. And if you haven't, you can go to another lender. So don't, sit around thinking that my bank's gonna give me this, my loan, and no one's called you. Okay?
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
You bet. So now we have a couple of non-PPP related questions. These are more related to the pandemic. I know that the first one that came in was that I'm extremely concerned about the economy, our food supply, and the mental health of our society. What is being done in Connecticut to gently get things moving back in the direction of normal? I mean, I know that this is a big issue. We have a lot of mental health issues going on. The governor has announced a Reopen Connecticut group, which I think we have another question on, dealing with transparency. And he's looking at those issues to try and get Connecticut back on its feet and its economy going again, but he's doing it in a measured approach to try and, while he's trying to get the economy moving, he's also mindful that we can't create another situation where I'm going to say the virus and infection exceed the healthcare capacity, and we want to make sure and maintain that the curve continues to be bent and we remain within healthcare capabilities. I don't know if you've heard anything else, Jason or Ben.
No, I mean, everybody's just sort of trying to thread the needle, and it's a delicate tightrope. You guys are hearing it, and folks who are watching are thinking the same things. Some people who want to open up yesterday. There's some people who think we should be holding off all summer. It just depends on your perspective. If you're a small business owner and you started your business 20 years ago and it's your whole life, and all of a sudden you're worried that it's not going to be in existence next month, you're pretty panicked, and you want to open right away. So it really is a delicate tightrope. And Kevin, to your point, the governor rolled out some ideas today that were fairly general. Now, I've already gotten a lot of questions and I don't really have answers for them yet. But with the goal being that we're going to allow businesses, not we, I mean, the governor's going to permit businesses that he believes can be kept safe and healthy to open, and prohibit businesses that he believes can't be opened safely in a healthy way to remain closed. And look, this is uncharted, and to the governor's credit, I think he's trying to do what he thinks is best. Whether you agree or don't agree is up for debate. But as to the pace at which it goes, I don't know. I mean, I'm very happy. 2 months ago I was saying that the benchmark really is hospitalizations, and that really is the curve to look at, and we've seen that go down for over a week. That's a good trend, and it needs to continue. So if that continues to happen, I think it's happening actually a little bit more steeply than a lot of folks have anticipated. maybe we see a change from what the governor laid out today, and we see things to accelerate a little bit more. I don't know. I don't have that crystal ball, and that circle of influence around the governor honestly doesn't include me. So I don't know exactly what that group is thinking.
Well, Jason, with that, I'll go into the next question. And it today was some good news. We do have some things opening up, but the governor does have this committee for Reopen Connecticut, and a lot of the people that I've been talking to think they're meeting in secrecy, and they want to know if their meetings can be open, or they FOIable. And I haven't heard anything yet, but I know it's a big concern because legislators don't have a seat at the table with this. It's all governor picked people, and there's a concern there about what's going on behind closed doors. So I don't know if either one of you guys have anything on that.
Yeah, it's funny, you mentioned that there are no legislators involved. Maybe at first, glance, you say, well, gee, we need more politicians involved in this. But at the same time, and Ben and Kevin, you guys know this, we're dealing with it every day. We're really kind of close to the ground on this. We're hearing from the business owner, the employee who's trying to get their unemployment, the senior citizen who's worried about their health and the health of those in their family. So, we're kind of close to it. I was really hoping that when that group of influencers came out in that committee, it's great that we've got some heavy hitters on there, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, which is valuable. I kind of want to see the guy who owns the neighborhood restaurant. I kind of want to hear that guy's opinion, and I think that was a little bit lacking. I think that's a perspective that legislators and folks who are on Main Street could probably give, and that's really not there right now. But in terms of transparency, Ben, to your point, if everybody in the public can hear that discussion, then there's a better opportunity for folks like that guy who owns the restaurant on the corner to then chime in. Maybe they come to us, maybe they talk to the news and they get the word out that way. But there are sectors of this small business economy that I don't really think are represented right now. And if there were more transparency among that group, I think that could change. And I don't know if you guys have any
Yeah, a
other.
little bit of the more mom and pop shop owners would be nice to have their input, but I didn't see that. Thank you.
Well, that's what I'm hearing when I talk with folks is they are concerned about the transparency issue, and they're concerned about how you have this big group. I mean, it is unwieldy. I would have thought the governor would have been a little bit more narrowly tailored, but in reality, it's a big group, and it's not operating in sunlight, in transparency. And the reopening is going to affect many people. And especially with the way the government has handled this in some areas, I mean, I think they've done a decent job, but in other areas, absolutely horrible. For instance, with the unemployment checks, both getting through the applications, getting the checks out to folks, and now trying to do the communication with the federal government to get the $600 match. But what we have also is a bit of administration that's tone deaf to individuals who don't have, a paycheck. They don't have savings. They live paycheck to paycheck. And when you shut down a business for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, and there's no money coming into the household, it's really not a good feeling for that individual. And that's where, like Jason, you were touching on, we're their representatives. And as much as people call us politicians, we're also the individuals that work between the people we represent and the government that governs us. And we're the voice of those people who aren't represented in the administration, that are standing in both the unemployment line and the food line and saying that what's going on isn't working. And we want to go back to work. We want to get back to business. And, we understand there's a health issue, granted, but not being able to pay your bills, not being able to feed your family is also a very important issue. And so the transparency would be really nice to see what this group is actually advising the governor and how they're going about it. What's on their agenda, what's their focus, and is it the same focus that these folks that are standing in the food lines and the unemployment lines are experiencing? Are they hearing that resonate And is that part of the conversation? When you don't do it in transparency, people don't know. And there's a fear of the unknown with what's going on. And I think that's a big issue. So, questions?
Yeah, we've got some more questions, and let's see if we can move on. So Eileen has a few questions. I'll start with the first one. She asks, can you add some insight to why the number of deaths at nursing homes in Connecticut seems so high? And she references Shelton, where there are quite a few nursing home deaths. And I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I have yesterday's reporting, and it's pretty significant. I mean, and it really just comes down to science and society. You know, the biggest factor is population density. And you've got a lot of people in nursing homes and assisted living, in generally close quarters, who intermingle with one another, especially in assisted living communities where they're in the same dining room, and they're also an older, frailer population. So, you know, the virus gets in by way of a visitor, and this is before visitors were prohibited. But once it gets in, it gets in, and it can be very, very difficult within the community to isolate that. And that's why you see in a lot of towns, and not just Shelton, but in a lot of towns, I believe Stratford's had some nursing home fatalities as well. You guys would know far better than me, but that's how it happens, and unfortunately, it's not a surprise. I mean, this is it's how the virus spreads. And I should also say too, knowing folks from a lot of these nursing homes, the folks who work there, the folks who run the nursing homes, they're devastated at what's happening, and they've taken great steps to try and mitigate the risk. And they've done a lot of things right, but in some cases, it it happens, and it's a terrible thing to say, but the best laid plans of mice and men, a virus is a virus, and it's still transmitted. So in terms of why you've seen fatalities in nursing homes on such a scale, that I hope maybe a little bit explains why.
Well, it also gets to why, we took the steps, or the government took the steps with regards to this health issue to begin with, and that is to protect those folks that are most vulnerable. And as we thought before, the virus caught on as big as it did, one of the biggest areas is individuals who are older with underlying health issues, and that's predominantly what you have in nursing homes. It's also, we experience something like this at assisted living facilities, as well as, senior housing and congregate situations. So wherever you put people, as you mentioned, in high density, but what you have here is high density coupled with an at-risk population. And so that's a significant, factor. It's why, the steps were taken by the governor to try and deal with this issue. But it's also a focus as to why we need to make sure that the employees and the healthcare workers that serve our seniors, they need to make sure that they get the PPE and the protective gear so that they can continue to do the good job that they're doing. While the state has given some reimbursement to these facilities to make sure that they can cover that, they haven't gone far enough, at least in my opinion, to make sure that they're made whole so that they have the resources and the staff and the capability to service our seniors. So, but that's an issue for another day. But you brought up a very good point with that, and it's one that I've been, and I know I've been on a couple of calls with Representative McGorty with regards to this, that it's a significant issue.
Yeah, and Kevin, to your point on PPE, it seems, I work in healthcare, and it seems as though the state is kind of starting to catch up a little bit in terms of the distribution of personal protective equipment. But in the initial stages, and you may have seen it in the news, a lot of this effort in terms of distributing PPE to nursing homes and healthcare providers, and even now sort of moving into other essential businesses like grocery and things along those lines, actually started in the private sector. It started from private donors. who are able to organize things. And that really helped in the early stages of this, because there was kind of a gap in the state's ability to distribute this equipment. So the private sector stepped in and made it happen. Here in Shelton, we have a company, Modern Plastics, that pretty much retooled their entire operation to create plastic face shields for healthcare providers. Nobody asked them to do that. They just recognized it was the right thing to do when they stepped up. So, and that's the strength of communities like ours. It's the strength of small businesses. Modern Plastics is a small business. But those are the kind of things that keep people safe, and those are the kind of things that keep communities together and healthy and united. So,
Well, and this kind of dovetails with what we were talking about just before with the uh, transparency in the Reopen Connecticut. And what they're talking about is, we just witnessed what happened with the PPE and the lack thereof, and the government's response in dealing with that issue. Well, by all accounts that you hear on the news is that if we go back and reopen, there is a likelihood of a rebound again in the fall. It would be nice to know now, what is our government doing to prepare and plan for that? Are they working with places like Modern Plastics in the private sector to start to build in that infrastructure and capacity? Are they looking at that issue, and are they putting the proper policies in place so that we don't end up in the same situation again? But when you don't have the clearness and sunlight of day on the I'm going to say the conversation, you really don't know whether that's happening or not.
yeah. And we're going to start to wrap up, but we actually have a question from Donna, and I want to try to address it. And Donna, if you're watching, I have a lot of information on this that we just got today. I will send it all to you, but I do want to read a little bit of it for those who haven't necessarily asked for it specifically. And it's about unemployment for self-employed individuals. And if it looks like I'm reading from my screen, it's because I am, and I don't want to get it wrong. This is a question about the PUA, which is the Federal Unemployment Program. It's benefits for self-employeds. And they can start the process to complete step one. This is actually a two-step process. And you start it today, but the system itself won't be ready to accept applications until next week. Sounds crazy, but bear with me. So the first step in this is to apply to the Department of Labor's regular unemployment system, just the regular old employment system, and then get denied. Bear with me. As a self-employed individual, in order to get accepted into the self-employed program, you have to be denied first. There'll be a series of correspondence via email back and forth with the Department of Labor. But then at step two, once you get that rejection, that denial, you can apply for the unemployed benefits. But again, that unemployed benefit system isn't available until next week. So try to follow what I just said. I'm honestly, we just received it an hour and a half ago, so I'm still digesting it too. But I'll try and filter this information out to as many folks as possible. And we're gonna sort of put an end on this for tonight. But Ben and Kevin and I are always available. Call our offices, email our offices. For those of us who have our cell phone numbers, call our cell phones, whatever works. We don't care how you get in touch with us, as long as you get in touch with us, and we'll help out in any way we can. But again, too, we're limited in that sometimes we don't have any more information than you have. Especially with the unemployment issues. I mean, today is literally the first moment that I've had more information than somebody else. And in fact, a lot of times it's been folks in the community telling me something I didn't know yet, because we're getting it in real time. Sometimes I know, when I find something out, and when Ben and Kevin find something out, it's because we watched the press conference just like you watched the press conference, and that's the first we heard of it. So just keep the questions coming. If you have issues or concerns, is something you think we can help with, don't be that person who says, "Oh, I don't want to bother my legislator," because some people say that. Don't just reach out and tune into these and get us any way you can get us.
And Jason and Kevin, before we wrap up, I do have one question. I know that the governor's plan came out today to open up certain services and that, but we got a question from Robert, who he's got prostate cancer and he's looking to get treatment, but I guess they call that elective surgery, and he's waiting to see when they're going to be allowed to start having those treatments. So I don't know if you guys heard anything today about that. And Robert, if you're listening, I wish you the best of luck. I'm sorry that they chose to make that elective surgery instead of mandatory. You know, get you in there, get your treatment, get you better. So hang in there. And if you guys know about that stuff, Jason, you're in the health field, maybe something.
Yeah, I mean, I know about this much of what is a very big problem. I mean, the issue of what is elective and what is not, what is discretionary, what's not is, you know, is sort of up for interpretation. And in many cases, a lot of hospitals are making that determination on their own. You know, I would encourage anybody with this question to contact their healthcare provider directly and get an answer and demand an answer as to why this thing can't wait, especially in an environment. My wife, you know, Becky works in a hospital, so I get it. In an environment where we are seeing the curve, you know, move downward a touch, and hospitals aren't quite as strained. And I understand we want to limit exposure in a healthcare setting, but if you're questioning why you have to wait for your procedure because it's deemed elective by your healthcare facility, my only piece of advice is bang away at your healthcare facility, your healthcare provider, and don't stop complaining until you get the service you need. And if there's somebody from a hospital, you know, is it a hospital administrator watching this? You don't like what I just said? Tough. But people need to call and need to get the services they need. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts.
That was good. Thank you.
But thank you, everybody for joining us. Thanks also to Ben and Jason for taking time. I think these are beneficial, and keep the questions coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Julio. Also, thank you for listening, for coming on tonight. Kevin, thank you. Jason, have a good night.
Take care.